57 critically injured survivors. One hospital pushed past its breaking point. And the one person who saved them all was someone the hospital had fired that same morning. Stay with me because what happens next will change how you see authority and competence forever. When Director Owen Mercer walked into the emergency wing after the crash, he expected chaos. What he found was something far worse. 57 critically injured survivors, every single one of them stabilized, and a hallway full of exhausted staff standing in complete silence. He turned to the nearest nurse, a young woman whose hands were still trembling, and demanded to know who had managed all of this. She didn't meet his eyes when she answered. She just pointed toward the exit doors and said quietly that it had been the nurse they suspended that morning, Lena Price. The woman's security had walked out of the building that same morning. If this is your first time here, stories like this one are what Fireside Files is all about. Real human moments where everything that matters gets stripped down to its core. If that's something you want more of, hitting subscribe to Fireside Files takes 1 second, and it means you won't miss what comes next. Lena Price had worked the emergency department at Ridgeway Memorial for 11 years. And in all that time, she had never once put her name on a success that wasn't entirely hers to claim. When a patient walked out alive, she felt the quiet satisfaction of someone who had done exactly what they came to do. She didn't need the attending physician to turn around and say, "Well done." She didn't need the charge nurse to mention her name in the debrief. The work itself was enough, and that had always been enough. What most of her colleagues didn't know, and what Lena had never offered, was that she had spent 4 years as a combat medic before she ever set foot in a civilian hospital. She had triaged casualties in conditions that no textbook prepared anyone for, in places where the difference between a correct decision and a hesitation was measured in heartbeats. When she came home, she didn't talk about it. Not because it was too painful, but because she understood that the moment people knew, they would start listening to her differently, filtering everything she said through the lens of that history, rather than judging it on its own merit. She wanted to be heard for what she knew now, not given credit for what she had survived before. Dr. Corbin Vale was the kind of man who had built his entire professional identity around the architecture of the hospital system. Its hierarchies, its protocols, its chain of command. He wasn't cruel by nature, and he genuinely believed that the structures he upheld were what kept patients safe. But somewhere along the way, that belief had calcified into something less noble. He had stopped being able to distinguish between a protocol that protected a patient and a protocol that protected his own authority. And that distinction mattered enormously when lives were on the line. He and Lena had circled each other for years without open conflict. There had been moments where she suggested differently, and he overrode her, and she turned out to have been right. But neither of them had pushed it far enough to force a confrontation, until that morning. The patient was a man in his mid-50s, brought in after collapsing at his office. The preliminary scans were inconclusive, the chest X-ray unremarkable, and his vitals sat in a range that was technically acceptable. Dr. Vale reviewed the results, ordered a second round of blood work, and noted in the chart that they would reassess in 40 minutes. It was a reasonable decision, by every standard the hospital recognized. Lena read the chart, looked at the man lying in Bay 4, and felt something tighten in her chest that had nothing to do with her own body. She had seen this before, not in a textbook, not in a simulation, but in the field, in the particular way a person's skin loses its color, not all at once, but slowly, almost politely, as though the body is apologizing for what it's about to do. The man's pressure was holding, but his pulse had a quality she didn't like, a subtle irregularity that the monitors hadn't flagged yet, because the algorithm wasn't designed to catch what her hands already knew. She went to find Dr. Vale. She found him at the nurse's station reviewing another chart, and she told him calmly that she believed the patient in Bay 4 was bleeding internally, and that waiting 40 minutes was going to cost him his life. Dr. Vale didn't look up immediately. When he did, his expression wasn't angry. It was the particular brand of patience that people deploy when they've already decided not to take something seriously. He told her that the scans showed no evidence of internal hemorrhage, that the protocol existed for exactly this kind of situation, and that he appreciated her concern, but the decision had been made. Lena stood there for a moment and understood something clearly. He wasn't dismissing her read of the patient. He was dismissing the idea that her read of the patient could matter more than his. Those were two entirely different things, and only one of them could be resolved with more data. She went back to Bay 4, checked the patient's pulse again, and made the call herself. She bypassed the attending's order, contacted the rapid response team directly, and had the patient moved toward the OR before Dr. Vale had finished his next chart note. The surgical team opened him up and found active internal bleeding that would have been catastrophic within the hour. The patient survived. Dr. Vale was informed of this while Lena was still outside the OR. And what happened next had nothing to do with the patient's outcome, and everything to do with what it meant that she had been right. He didn't come to find her privately. He came to the main floor where 2 other nurses and a resident were present. And he told her that what she had done was a direct violation of the hospital's chain of command, that it didn't matter whether the outcome was positive, and that a system only functions when people operate within their defined roles. His voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it that wasn't about the system at all. Lena recognized it because she had heard it before, in other voices in other places. The sound of a person who has confused their authority with their identity, and cannot separate a challenge to one from a threat to the other. She didn't argue. She had learned a long time ago that arguing in that moment in front of those people would only give him more material to work with. She listened, and when he finished, she handed over her badge and picked up the personal items from her station without being asked. A security officer walked her to the elevator and out through the lobby. She carried a small cardboard box, a coffee mug, a spare pen, a photograph she kept taped to the inside of her locker. She walked out into the parking lot and stood beside her car in the morning light. She wasn't crying. She wasn't shaking. She was doing what she had trained herself to do in the aftermath of decisions that couldn't be undone, which was to simply be present in the moment, and not try to solve anything until the noise in her head had quieted down enough to think clearly. She had been right, and she had been punished for it. And both of those things were true at the same time, and she was old enough to know that the world didn't always reconcile them neatly. She set the cardboard box on the hood of her car and looked at it. The photograph on top was of a group of people she had served with overseas, their faces sun-damaged and squinting into a desert noon. None of them would have been surprised by what had just happened to her. They would have recognized it immediately. The particular injury of being seen as a problem by the people you were trying to protect. But here's the twist nobody in that hospital saw coming. The siren started as a single sound in the distance, and became many within seconds. Lena turned toward the hospital entrance and watched the first ambulance cut across the parking lot, followed by a second, then a third, then a military transport vehicle that had no business being this far from a base. A news helicopter appeared over the tree line to the east. She had heard about a cargo plane going down near the city that morning, something mentioned briefly on the radio during her commute, but she hadn't thought about it again until right now, watching the vehicles pour in, and understanding the math of what was unfolding with the kind of cold clarity that only came from having seen it before. A young soldier came running out of the ambulance bay doors, still wearing a blood-soaked sleeve, scanning the parking lot with the expression of someone who needed help and would take it from anyone still standing. He spotted Lena, her scrubs, her posture, the fact that she was the only person outside who wasn't moving away from the building, and he ran toward her. He told her they needed everyone, that it was bad, that people were going to die if there weren't enough hands. He didn't know she had been suspended that morning. He didn't know about Dr. Vale, or the chain of command, or the cardboard box sitting on the hood of her car. He just saw someone who looked like they knew what they were doing, and he asked her to come back inside. Lena looked at the box. She thought about the photograph and the people in it, and what any one of them would have done if they had been standing where she was standing. She thought about the patients being unloaded from those vehicles right now. People who had boarded a plane that morning with no idea it would be the last ordinary thing they ever did. None of them had anything to do with what Dr. Vale had decided about her. None of them deserved to pay for it. She picked up the box, set it on the ground beside her rear tire, and walked back toward the hospital entrance at a pace that was not quite a run, but left no doubt about her direction. The security officer who had walked her out 20 minutes earlier was now stationed at the ambulance bay, managing the incoming flow of patients. He saw her coming, took in the situation around him, and stepped aside without a word. There was no authority left to enforce in a moment like this, and he knew it. The emergency department looked nothing like it did on any other morning. Gurneys filled the hallway in both directions, some pushed against the walls, some left at angles where the teams had simply run out of room to maneuver. The floor near the ambulance bay doors was wet, a combination of rain tracked in from outside and fluids that had dripped from 4 lines pulled loose during transport. Monitors beeped from 3 directions at once. And underneath all of it was the sound that Lena had learned to track above everything else. The sound of people who were not making any noise at all. She moved through the doors and took in the room the way she had been trained to, not person by person, but as a whole, reading the shape of the crisis before focusing on any single part of it. What she saw confirmed what she had already suspected from the parking lot. The staff was working hard, but they were working in the wrong order. A resident near the entrance was triaging patients by the sequence they arrived, which was the instinct of someone trained in normal emergency medicine, and the exact wrong approach when the volume exceeded the department's capacity to treat everyone simultaneously. 3 of the loudest patients were receiving the most attention. A man lying against the far wall, with a gray pallor and barely perceptible chest movement, had not been reached yet. Lena went to the man against the wall first. She checked his pulse, pulled back his jacket, and found the source of what was happening to him. She turned to the nearest nurse, a young woman she recognized from the morning shift named Jamie, and told her clearly that this patient needed blood, and needed it now, that he was in hemorrhagic shock, and the quieter he was, the worse it actually was. Jamie moved without questioning her, which told Lena that at least some of the staff had already reached the point where they would follow whoever sounded like they knew what they were doing. From that moment, Lena stopped waiting for permission. She called out instructions across the department, the way she had once called them across much louder and much more dangerous ground, not loudly enough to add to the noise, but with a precision that cut through it. This patient to the OR immediately. That one could hold for 15 minutes. The woman in Bay 2 had a tension pneumothorax developing and needed a needle before she needed anything else. The teenage boy near the window was in more danger than his wound suggested, because his pressure had been dropping slowly for the past several minutes, and no one had caught the trend yet. A few of the staff hesitated, not because they doubted her reads, but because word had spread that she had been suspended that morning, and technically had no authority to be giving any orders at all. Lena understood that hesitation. She didn't argue with it, and she didn't try to explain herself. She just kept moving, kept making the calls, kept being right in ways that were immediately and visibly verifiable. And after the 3rd or 4th correct call, the hesitation dissolved on its own. Authority in a crisis was not a badge or a title. It was the accumulation of decisions that turned out to matter. Dr. Vale appeared at the department entrance about 30 minutes after Lena had returned. He stood at the threshold and took in the scene, and his first clear sight was of Lena standing in the center of the floor, directing the movement of patients and staff, with a kind of calm that did not belong to someone who had been escorted out of the building less than an hour ago. His expression shifted through several things in quick succession: recognition, disbelief, and then something that hardened back into the familiar shape of institutional authority. He started toward her. He was still several steps away when a soldier being helped down the hallway by 2 orderlies looked up and saw Lena's face. The soldier was a young man, maybe 22, with a compression bandage wrapped around his left leg that had already soaked through. Despite the two people supporting his weight, he straightened when he saw her, not all the way because his body wouldn't allow it, but enough to be unmistakable. He said her name the way soldiers say the names of people who pulled them back from somewhere they weren't supposed to come back from. Sergeant Price. The hallway didn't go silent all at once. It went quiet in a wave, starting near the soldier and moving outward as people registered what they had heard, and what it meant. Dr. Vale stopped walking. The resident who had been triaging by arrival order looked up from his clipboard. Jamie, who was running a line into the man Lena had found against the wall, turned her head toward the sound without letting go of what she was doing. Nobody said anything for a long moment. The soldier's voice had done the work of a full explanation, more efficiently than any words could have managed. The woman standing in the middle of their emergency department, the woman Dr. Vale had classified as a nurse who didn't know her place, had apparently been somewhere considerably more demanding than any of them had realized, and had apparently been someone considerably more capable than her job title suggested. Dr. Vale didn't move toward Lena again. He stood where he was, and for the first time that day, he had nothing prepared to say. He was still the chief of surgery. He still outranked everyone in the room by every official measure the hospital recognized, but the room had shifted around him in a way that those measures couldn't address, and he was sharp enough to know it. He didn't leave, and he didn't interfere. He moved to the side of the hallway and found a place where he could be useful, managing supply requests, coordinating with the surgical suites upstairs, quietly, without announcing it. It was the smallest possible version of doing the right thing, but it was something, and the staff noticed. Lena didn't look at him. She had already moved on to the next patient. The next hour was the hardest. The initial wave of casualties had been survivable because Lena had caught the system before it collapsed entirely and redirected it. But as more patients arrived and the staff's energy began to wear thin, the gaps started showing in different places. A surgical suite that had been running 3 simultaneous procedures hit a bottleneck when 2 of the cases became more complex than anticipated. Supplies that should have been restocked an hour earlier had not been. And a nurse spent several critical minutes tracking down a second defibrillator when the first one's battery failed. Jamie was the one who broke, and Lena saw it coming before it happened. The young nurse had been holding herself together through sheer force of will. But will has a ceiling, and Jamie hit hers, standing next to a patient who needed an 4-line restarted, and a crash cart checked, and a family member removed from the room, all at the same time. She started crying, not quietly, but in the sudden, uncontrolled way that happens when a person has been pushing too hard for too long, and the body simply overrides the decision to keep going. Lena crossed the room to her in 4 steps. She didn't put a hand on Jamie's shoulder or tell her it was going to be okay, because none of those things were what the moment needed. She positioned herself directly in Jamie's line of sight and spoke in a tone that was not unkind, but left absolutely no room for the crying to continue right now. She told Jamie that she needed her to hold the 4-line in Bay 6, that she could fall apart completely when this was over, and Lena would sit with her while she did it. But that right now Bay 6 needed her, and Bay 6 couldn't wait. Jamie took one ragged breath, nodded, and went to Bay 6. What Lena was doing, beyond treating the patients in front of her, was something closer to what she had done overseas. Managing a system under conditions the system had not been built for, identifying the points of failure before they became catastrophic, and making real-time decisions about where to spend limited resources in order to keep the largest number of people alive. It was not a skill that appeared anywhere in her hospital job description. It was not something she had learned in a nursing program or a continuing education course. It was something that had been built into her through a specific kind of experience, and it was the only reason the department was still functioning. The last group of patients arrived in the late afternoon, 5 of them transported together from the far end of the crash site, which had taken longer to reach. 2 of them were critical in ways that immediately narrowed the options available. The first was a soldier, young, with a severe chest injury that had compromised his ability to breathe on his own. The second was a man in his late 40s with a traumatic brain injury who was losing consciousness in stages, each stage more irreversible than the last. There was one ventilator available. Lena stood between them and understood the full weight of what was being asked of her. The protocols gave you frameworks, and the frameworks gave you language. But the actual choice, the one that had to be made in the next 90 seconds, belonged to the person standing in front of both patients, with enough experience to read what each of them actually needed, and what each of them could actually survive. She looked at the soldier. She looked at the man with the brain injury. She read what she could read in the time she had, which was not everything, but was more than anyone else in that room could have read in the same window. She assigned the ventilator to the soldier, and directed the team managing the second patient toward an alternative protocol that offered a lower probability of survival, but not an impossible one. Nobody questioned her. Some of them couldn't have explained exactly why they trusted the call, except that by that point in the afternoon, they had watched her make a long series of calls that turned out to be right, and that accumulation meant something. Lena knew that the rightness of this particular decision would only become clear later. She moved to the next patient because there was always a next patient, and standing still was not a choice the room could afford. The last patient was stabilized at 6:47 in the evening. Lena knew the exact time because she had been watching the clock above Bay 3 for the final 20 minutes, not out of impatience, but because she had learned long ago that time was the one variable in a mass casualty event that never stopped mattering, right up until the moment it finally did. When the monitor above the young soldier showed a stable rhythm and held it for 4 consecutive minutes, she allowed herself to stop moving for the first time since she had walked back through those doors nearly 9 hours ago. She found a section of wall near the supply corridor and put her back against it. Her hands were at her sides. The scrubs she had put on that morning were stiff in places where things had dried, and there was a bruise forming on her left forearm from a cart that had caught her during the second wave. She hadn't noticed it until now. That was the way it always worked. The body kept a careful record of everything it had been through, and presented the bill only after the emergency had passed. Around her, the department was settling into the particular quiet that follows a sustained crisis, not the silence of a calm night, but the silence of people who had pushed past the limit of what they thought they could do, and were now simply existing in the aftermath, unsure of what to feel, or whether feeling anything was even possible yet. Jamie was sitting on the floor near Bay 6 with her knees pulled up, staring at a point somewhere in the middle distance. 2 residents had found chairs and were sitting with their elbows on their knees, not talking. The attending who had been running the second surgical suite was leaning against the nurse's station with his eyes closed, still in his gown. Director Owen Mercer arrived at 7:15. He had been reached by phone while across town, and had driven directly to the hospital without stopping. He came through the main entrance and walked past the overflow area where patients were still being monitored, past the family waiting room where people sat in the specific anguish of not yet knowing, and through the double doors into the hallway where all of it had happened. He stopped just inside and looked at what was in front of him. The dried fluid on the floor, the gurneys lining both walls, the staff members who were present and accounted for, but who looked like people who had run much farther than they had trained for. All 57 patients were alive. He had been told this on the phone, but seeing the space where it had happened was different from being told about it. Owen walked the length of the hallway slowly. When he reached the center of the department, he stopped, turned to the room, and asked who had managed all of this. He wasn't asking for a report. His voice had the quality of a man who already understood that something significant had happened here, and needed to hear the human answer before he could deal with the institutional one. Nobody spoke immediately. The question sat in the air for several seconds, not because the answer was complicated, but because saying it out loud required acknowledging everything that came with it. Every person in that room knew exactly what the answer was, and the knowing was heavy in a way that simple facts usually weren't. Jamie lifted her head from where she had been staring at the floor, looked at Owen directly, and told him it had been Lena Price, the nurse they had suspended that morning. She said it without editorializing, without anger, without anything extra. Just the plain fact of it, delivered in the flat tone of someone who was too exhausted for anything but the truth. Owen turned and crossed the department to where Lena was standing against the wall. He looked at her for a moment. The dried blood on her scrubs, the bruise on her forearm, the expression on her face that was not triumphant and not bitter, just the steady look of someone who had done what needed doing, and was now waiting to see what came next. He asked her why she had come back. Lena considered the question the way it deserved to be considered. Then she told him that the people in those ambulances hadn't done anything to her. Whatever had happened that morning between her and the hospital was between her and the hospital, and it had nothing to do with them. So she came back. The rest of it could wait. Owen was quiet for a moment. He looked at the floor between them, then back up at her, and something in his expression shifted. The way things shift in people who have just heard something simple that clarifies something complicated. He had spent 20 years running a hospital, 20 years managing the friction between people who held authority and people who held competence. And the cases where those two things didn't overlap were the ones that cost the most and stayed with him the longest. He was looking at one of those cases right now, and he knew exactly what it had nearly cost. He turned and looked at Dr. Vale, who had been standing near the nurse's station, but for the past several minutes in the stillness of a man who had run out of things to say. The two of them held each other's gaze for a moment. Owen didn't speak, and the silence carried more weight than any formal reprimand could have managed in that particular moment. Dr. Vale looked away first, down at the floor, involuntarily, in the way that people look away when they can no longer hold the distance between what they believed about themselves and what the room is showing them. The staff who had watched him walk Lena out of the building that morning noticed. Nobody said anything about it because nobody needed to. Later that evening, after the patient transfers had been managed and the family notifications made and the department brought down to something resembling its normal state, Owen found Lena again near the locker room. He told her the suspension was being lifted, effective immediately. He told her that a formal internal review was being opened, not into her conduct, but into how the department evaluated and responded to the judgment of experienced clinical staff, and what the morning's events suggested about where that process had failed. He said it plainly without dressing it up. Lena thanked him without making it into a larger moment than it needed to be. She was not interested in the lifted suspension as vindication. She had known that morning that she was right, and that rightness had not required institutional confirmation to be real. What mattered now was what changed going forward, and she said as much directly, in the way that she had always spoken when she was saying something she actually meant. The review that followed in the coming weeks was not comfortable for anyone involved. Dr. Vale did not lose his position, but he lost something more difficult to recover: the unquestioned deference of the people around him. The investigation surfaced a pattern of experienced nurses having their concerns dismissed without meaningful engagement, and the hospital's administration could not treat that pattern as a series of isolated events. New protocols were drafted, imperfect as all protocols are, but better than what had existed before. Dr. Vale did not apologize to Lena directly, not in those first weeks. But several months later, in a brief hallway conversation that neither of them had planned, he told her that he had gone back and reviewed the case from that morning, the patient in Bay 4, and that he understood now what she had seen and why she had acted. He didn't frame it as an apology. He framed it as a statement of fact, which was perhaps the most honest form of accountability he was capable of at that point. Lena accepted it for what it was. She had long since stopped needing it to be more. The morning after the crash, before any of the reviews or conversations or protocol revisions, Lena went back to the parking lot to retrieve the cardboard box she had left beside her rear tire. It was still there, undisturbed, with the photograph of her former unit sitting on top. She picked up the box and carried it back through the lobby and down the hallway to the locker room, where Jamie was waiting with her badge. The young nurse held it out with both hands, not saying anything. And Lena took it the same way, without ceremony, without the need to turn the moment into a speech. She clipped the badge to her scrubs and walked back out into the department. The morning shift was beginning to arrive. The overnight staff was giving handoffs at the nurses' station. The monitors were doing what monitors do. And somewhere down the hall, a family was hearing news that would reshape the rest of their lives. And somewhere else, a patient was waking up in a bed they hadn't expected to reach. The emergency department at Ridgeway Memorial was running the way it always ran, imperfectly and necessarily, and Lena Price was in it, not as a symbol of anything, not as a lesson anyone had learned overnight, just as a nurse who had shown up this morning the same way she had shown up every morning, ready to do the work that needed doing for whoever needed it done. There's something in Lena's story that stays with you long after it ends. The idea that real capability doesn't announce itself. It shows up quietly, does what needs to be done, and asks for nothing in return. Most of us will never face a mass casualty event. But most of us know what it feels like to be dismissed by someone who has authority, but not necessarily wisdom, or to watch a person with less power but more competence get pushed to the side. Lena's answer to that wasn't a speech. It was a choice to walk back through the door anyway, because the people who needed her had nothing to do with the injustice done to her. That's the kind of integrity that doesn't need an audience. And honestly, it's the kind of story worth thinking about for more than just the few minutes it takes to hear it. If this resonated with you, subscribe to Fireside Files so you don't miss what's coming next. There are more stories like this one, and they're worth your time.